Hi, if you like the video, please remember to subscribe.
Hi, I'm Rob from robphoto.com, and today we're going to be having a quick look at the Canon EF 50mm f1.8 Mark 1 prime lens. Picked up this lens from the car boot sale on Sunday for the princely sum of £4. Couldn't believe it. The reason being that it's quite sought after, this lens. There's a pecking order for 50mm in the Canon range. In the EF autofocus ones, you start off with something like the 50mm EF 1.8 Mark II, which you can currently get for well under £100. I think I saw it on Amazon for about £75 the other day. Then you get the 50mm f 1.8 Mark I version, and then they do the Mark II. Then they do the 50mm 1.4, which I think is about £300, and I think then they do a 1.2 as well, which is silly money. But the nifty 50s, the 50mm, are always worth having in your camera bag. I have done a review on the site about the 50mm 1.8 Mark II with a plastic mount on, but I think it might be good to revisit where you might want to try out a 50mm and just have a quick look at some sample images as well, which I'll put on the end of the video. So, 50mm prime lens. So unlike the lens that probably came with your camera, you can't zoom in and out with these. It's a fixed focal length. 50mm traditionally was the lens that would come with most cameras when you bought one in the film days, and up until when zooms became reliable and cheap. A 50mm gives you a average kind of angle of view on a full frame film camera or a full frame digital. They're relatively, because they make so many of them, they're relatively cheap to make. And also, it offers not very much perspective distortion as well, so it's good for all sorts of shooting where you don't want, say, portraits where you want people to look natural, or buildings where you want them to look natural. You do have to be careful though, because on a crop frame DSLR, like any of the Canon DSLRs, apart from things like the 5D Mark III, 5D Mark II, etc., all the budget ones, they're all what we call a crop frame, which means that they don't use the whole size that a piece of film would be, and so the lens is actually more like the equivalent of a 75mm lens. So that means it's quite telephoto, so you won't get a big angle of view when you put it on a camera like this. And so one of the best ways, if you're thinking about getting a 50 and thinking will it suit your shooting style, get your zoom, have a look on the zoom barrel, and you'll probably see that it's got settings on. And if you've got something like the 18 to 55 IS like I've got, just set it to almost all the way zoomed in, and then just go out and take some pictures of it and see, what you like, see what really appeals to you. And if you like it, then think about getting a 50. Now, what's different about the 50mm 1.8 Mark I? Well, obviously, we have a metal mount rather than the plastic mount. The focusing ring is in the middle of the barrel there, rather than on the tip like on the Mark II. And on the top, I don't know whether you can see it as well, there's your distance markings for doing things like hyperfocal distance and things like that. Generally, it's meant to be made a little bit better as well. However, they do go for considerably more than the 50mm Mark II plastic mount on eBay. But if you are thinking about buying one second hand, the one thing I would say is just bear in mind that a new 50mm Mark II is probably round about between £70 and £100 off somewhere like Amazon, and that will come with a year's guarantee. It hasn't been used on a camera for 20 years like this one probably has, and so the advantages in terms of image quality over the Mark I and the Mark II, I don't think really there's that much difference. But obviously if you can pick up one of these lenses really cheap like I did, because it came on a film camera and people didn't understand how the intrinsic value of the lens, then definitely give it a go. The 50mm on a camera like a 350D all the way through to the new 650D, I wouldn't really call it a walk around lens. It's a little bit too telephoto for that. You're quite zoomed in. It's great for helping you pick out extracts from images and landscapes, But ultimately, if you're left on the camera all the time for sort of doing street photography or just general landscapes and things, you might find it a bit limiting because you want to see a big angle of view, so only giving you a bit. Where the 50mm really comes into its own, however, is when you're doing portraits. The longer focal length, like the 50 or more like a 75mm on a crop frame sensor, is very flattering for subjects as well. If you've ever taken pictures with your wide angle lens on like 18mm, you'll notice that people's noses get bigger and their heads a little bit distorted, but the 50mm forces you to step back a little bit and just gives you an overall more flattering sort of image. So it's a very nice portrait lens on a crop sensor body. Also f1.8. Why is that so important? Well, you can probably see, in fact if I take the lens off the camera, you probably see that massive hole in the middle. Your average kit lens has a maximum aperture, a maximum hole, if you like, that lets the light through, about f3.5. This one goes down to f1.8, so it means it can let an awful lot of light in. So if you want to shoot in low light conditions, say inside, and you don't want to use a flash, that f1.8 allows you to do that. But lots of photographers are mainly interested in the f1.8 side of it because of something called depth of field. And your depth of field is how much of a particular subject is in focus. And if you want to have what we would call selective focus, so like those wedding or fashion portraits where you've got a person and their eyes are in focus and their face is in focus but everything else is nicely blurred, then big apertures are the way to do it. And with 1.8 you can get a very small depth of field indeed. And so when you're doing portraits you can stop down to f1.8, 2.8, 2, etc. Play around with your distance from the subject and get some very nice portraits with very small depth of field. But it's also good for things like food photography, product photography, anything where you want to isolate your subject from the background and the foreground with small depth of field. However, there is a bit of a reality check when it comes to shooting at maximum apertures like f1.8. Because you might find when you first get a wide aperture lens, a 1.8 or a 2.8, you'll probably shoot and then come up with quite a lot of shots that are out of focus, and that can be quite frustrating. And the reason for that is because the depth of field, how much of your subject is in focus, can be very, very small. So if you're shooting at like f1.8 and you were, say, I don't know, say 3 feet away from your subject, so you were getting in close to do like a headshot, your depth of field is going to be something like 3 centimeters, so that much. So probably less than the distance between the tip of somebody's nose and their eye. And so if your subject is moving backwards and forwards even a little bit, or you're moving backwards and forwards only a little bit, or instead of focusing on their eyes you focus on their nose or on their hair as it's hanging down in front of their eyes, you'll get a photo that is slightly soft. So one of the things I would recommend is when you do get your 1.8 to 51.8 or 1.4, anything that's got a big maximum aperture, don't be tempted to continually shoot at f1.8, especially if you're in situations where you need to get the shot. By all means stop down to 2.8 or 2, but just bear in mind that depth of field is going to be small. And if you really want to get the shot and you're under time pressure, then don't mess around with 1.8 too much, because especially if your subject's moving, you're going to end up with lots of out of focus shots. So you may well say, well, what's the point then? Because you've got this 50mm 1.8 lens, it doesn't have image stabilization, and if you shoot at 1.8 you're going to end up with out of focus shots if your subject or you are moving around an awful lot. Well, the reason is it's a prime lens, so there's no zoom. So the idea is it's sharper. So if you shoot at f3.5, for example, which would be the maximum aperture of your kit lens, this lens will actually be significantly sharper because it's not at its maximum aperture. And with lenses we have something called the sweet spot, which is the point at which the lens has its maximum sharpness. And this is normally roughly a couple of stops down from wide open. So to get the maximum sharpness out of any, say, a 3.5 lens, you'd probably have to shoot at something like f8. And for a 1.8, probably 5.6 or 3.5, something like that. So that's one of the big reasons for using. Now, personally, after shooting with a 50mm quite a lot, and you'll see some of the example images at the end of the video. I think it's a great lens to have in your camera bag, and I think it's a great lens to whip out and put on your camera when you're doing subject shots of things like food or products, and portraits as well. Would I swap the 50mm 1.8 for something like my 18 to 55 or my 55 to 250? Well, no, I wouldn't, because I miss the ability to have that real wide angle for when I'm doing architecture and stuff like that. And obviously then I would want the telephoto side of the 55 to 250 as well. So a nifty 50, I think everybody should have one to shoot with, because they are so cheap. The 50mm Mark 1, would I buy one over a 1.2? Only if it was a real bargain, as in this one. Otherwise, buy a new Mark 2 and get the year's guarantee on it. But this, the kind of thing that seals the deal about why you should get a 50-1.8 is because they're very cheap. But the biggest thing is, if you take portraits of people with a 50-1.8 and then use that wider aperture, use like a 2 or a 3.28, or even play with a 1.8. It takes the sort of photographs that you can't take with a compact camera. It takes the sort of photographs that people look at afterwards and go, wow, that's brilliant, where did you get that camera, kind of thing. And that's because of that small depth of field, which you just can't really do with a compact camera. And that's something that the 50mm does very, very well indeed. So there we go, that's my little kind of mini review of the Canon 50mm f1.8 EF Mark 1 lens. My name's Rob from robnowphoto.com, and thanks for watching.